Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 99 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm joined by Aaron Stark. Aaron served in the U.S. Army as an Apache helicopter pilot, including on 2 tours in Afghanistan. He finished his term of service teaching at his alma mater, West Point Military Academy, as an assistant professor of economics after completing his master's in business administration at Harvard University. And he now works as a chief of staff at a Fortune 500 tech company. I invited Aaron onto the podcast today to discuss his recently published book, Disrupting Time: Industrial Combat, Espionage, and the Downfall of a Great American Company. It's the story of the Waltham Watch Company, headquartered in Waltham, Massachusetts, and how they were targeted by the Swiss watch industry at a time when Waltham was poised to dominate the global market through its development and use of cutting-edge technology, leaving the antiquated Swiss industry far behind. A pair of Swiss spies infiltrated the company in a last-ditch effort to save their own nation's failing industry and succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Christian W. and Frank W. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Aaron, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Sure. You have no idea, honestly, how excited I was to learn about your book, because I have to confess to you and to the listeners that I am not able to be objective about this story at all as much as I'd like to. That's because I myself have a very small watch collection, but the pride and joy of that collection is a Waltham Ordnance Department model from 1941. I've only had it less than a year now, and I love it. I wear it as often as I can. I switch out the strap all the time, and I just absolutely jumped at the chance to learn more about the company and its place in the world from you.
That's awesome. No, it's a great story.
Well, good. So the book was fascinating. I just read it a few days ago, as I already mentioned, and I learned quite a bit, like I said. But, when I'm looking at your bio that I just discussed a few minutes ago, Aaron, I noticed that it seems like a little bit of a departure from your study of economics and your work in the military, that sort of thing. So what is it that led you to write a book about industrial espionage in the post-Civil War era?
Yeah, I think the industrial espionage aspect is kind of the headline grabber. I think it's really a story of how industrial espionage affects the competitive dynamics of a market. And one of the things we can talk about in more detail later is a lot of research that I looked into on industrial espionage is it shows that it's never really a cause and effect. It's what happens at one point. Secrets are stolen, and it's not like a competitor directly just fails the next year or the next 2 years. It's usually a slow degradation of overall quality of what the company is able to do in its competition. And so that's really where it kind of intersected with my studies in business strategy and finance, was being able to look at the finances of the Waltham Watch Company and the strategic choices they made and the strategic choices the Swiss make, and where those interplay, ultimately leading to the downfall of the Waltham Watch Company. So that's how I became interested in the topic. Overall, how I came across this story was I had inherited this Waltham pocket watch from my grandfather. And I happened to be local in Boston at the time, attending Harvard, and Waltham is just down the road, a short, 5 or 10 miles. And so I began trying to learn everything I could about Waltham, and I came across this report by this guy named Jacques David, who wrote this report in 1877. And when I read the report, it struck me as a lot of elements that that seemed like they were espionage, but I didn't have any confirmation. So I began researching it. And so, in fact, if you are interested in reading this report, you can actually, I link to it on my website, which is aaronstarkbooks.com. I have a link there. You can go check out the PDF from the original translator, and you can read David's report. And I also have photos of David and some of the other things we'll talk about. But that's how I came across the story and began researching it. And I'm sure we'll get into more here shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to look at that. I have been on your site, but I haven't downloaded the report yet. But what you did say really struck a chord with me in the book is that this was not a fast-paced cause and effect. Like you mentioned, Waltham didn't tumble, just a few weeks or months or the next fiscal quarter or whatever have you, after David accomplished his goals anyway, but it took many years to play out. And I know we'll talk about that in a minute, but I guess in a way that it was unexpected to me because I'm used to things being a little bit faster paced these days, but it doesn't necessarily play out that way because companies still have a lot of strengths to rely on, regardless of when they might have lost their intellectual property.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things with industrial espionage is it's not so much the fact that David gets the information. I mean, a lot of people acquire interesting information, but have no idea what to do with it. The thing that really sets David apart and he's able to make these choices and guide the Swiss watch industry or influence the Swiss watch industry is he actually knows what to do with it. And that has an effect over decades. And we really see it degrading that competitive advantage over that, about 3-decade period.
Yes, absolutely. I was struck by his incredible competence throughout the book. It certainly seemed like they sent exactly the right man to accomplish what the Swiss needed to accomplish anyway, in regards to Waltham. So he was a very, very impressive guy, even though he was not like a professional intelligence collector or anything like that of the type that we normally discuss here. So
yeah, absolutely.
I do want to talk about him a little bit more in depth in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask, it seems like this is a story that is basically unknown until your book was published, even though it occurred, between 100 and 150 years ago. So why is it that you think that a large part of this story has not really been told, or at least told widely in the past?
Yeah, so I think a big portion begins with David when he returns to Switzerland. The Americans is where this all emanates from is the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, which we can talk more about that in a little bit. But basically, the Swiss come back from this and they are completely overwhelmed by the American watch industry, which they have more or less seen able to mass produce watches, while meanwhile the Swiss are an artisanal industry at the time, still making watches in homes and using hand tools. And so they're completely overwhelmed. And the Americans pick up, especially Waltham, they pick up on a lot of the writings of the Swiss and begin using them as marketing material. So David, when he writes his report, he knows that this is a potential, and he actually cautions against publishing his report. But really, one of the reasons he cautions against publishing his report is he's worried about compromising his sources. And he actually says in his report that if this thing gets, basically, if it gets legs and gets out there, the sources in the factories could be seriously compromised, and basically we would stop getting more information. So he asked that the report remain secret, and it mostly does remain secret until 1992. And a facsimile copy of the report gets released in 1992. It gets translated into English in 2004, and that's really when you start seeing it appear in literature. So the conventional narrative that you'll find in books and in articles is that Waltham and the other American watch companies naively shared this information with David. He writes this really interesting report, documents the entire American watch industry, focusing primarily on Waltham, the industry leader, and the rest is history. David's report already hints that this is probably not the case. But then I came across this letter when I was trying to get some confirmation of my suspicions. And it's a letter that David writes when he's in America in the fall of 1876 back to his boss at the Swiss trade industry who commissioned him to come over here. And in this letter, he actually states, I snuck in the factory incognito. He talks about having sources and we'll soon have the information we want. So he's basically saying all the quiet parts out loud that otherwise we don't get to see. And so that is, one of the reasons I think that it never is told is because people have a misconception of what the visit actually was. And then, quite frankly, I think it doesn't really fit into the kind of accepted marketing story of what we know about Swiss watches. We think of the Swiss as always the best the world's best watchmakers. But if we look back to 1876, as you see in the book, that was not the case. They were viewed as a much inferior watchmaking source compared to the Americans' mechanized production back in 1876. So it kind of runs contrary to our common belief of what watchmaking looks like in the history of that. And I think that's also played a part in it not really emerging. But I think one thing that's most interesting is I came across a 1987 Swiss article, an academic article, that refers to David as a spy. You will not find David's name almost anywhere apart from local histories prior to about 2000. So, is what struck me about this is there are people who knew either through oral tradition or local stories that David had done this and that he had stolen this information, and they actually call him a spy in the article. But you won't find David's name anywhere until the report's actually published, and more formally when it's actually translated into English. And then you actually see his name appear a lot. And in fact, there is one book that's called The History of the Swiss Watch Industry from Jacques David to Nicholas Hayek. So he definitely makes his mark once his name gets out there, but we don't actually find out about him until this report is published.
Amazing that it stayed quiet for so long from 1870s, 1880s up through 2004. That is incredible longevity for something to stay under wraps. Even, I mean, the British, I thought they were kind of the masters of that stuff, but they don't hold a candle to this Swiss watch industry, unfortunately. So that's such an amazing turn of fortune, too, because I think that anybody off the street who knows next to nothing about watches would immediately describe the Swiss watch industry now as the, absolute leaders worldwide. And to think that it was the complete opposite and that they were deeply, deeply afraid of this American watch company that many people today could not name at all. It's quite a reversal of fortunes. So can you talk about how Waltham got into the position to begin with to be such a existential threat to the Swiss industry?
Yeah. So Waltham's begins in the 1850s, and right around 1850, they begin in Boston and they quickly go bankrupt. And this businessman named Royal Robbins buys them out of bankruptcy in the mid to late 1850s. And he is a experienced businessman. He's only 33 years old. He's basically what we'd consider a millionaire once you convert for his wealth. And he brings a bunch of business tactics to the concept of mass manufacturing. When he buys the company, though, they don't have any concept of what we would know as mass manufacturing yet. So they begin bringing in people who are experts from the firearms industry. And there's a gentleman named Ambrose Webster who they bring from the firearms industry. And he is a mechanic, and he begins inventing machines that can do automated production or semi-automated production. And by the early 1860s, during the American Civil War, Waltham is able to produce, thousands of watches using mechanized production. And he happens to kind of be at the right time with all these soldiers entering service. This idea of time or punctuality is a very nascent topic. Prior to this, only the very wealthy can afford a watch, and everybody uses clocks. But with the synchronized maneuvers of warfare, people actually begin to want a watch. And actually, at the Battle of Vicksburg, General Grant emphasizes the importance of timekeeping. He actually orders that all of his army synchronize all of their watches. And that's kind of one of the first examples we have of where people are actually trying to make sure they are all at the same time doing the exact same thing. And so when all these soldiers leave service, they begin becoming indentured to this idea of punctuality. And by 1880, the idea that you have to be on time someplace is actually, it's a thing. And so they become the linchpin of railroads, scientific management, time costing, billable hours. And, now, of course, we think of our day built in 30-minute blocks. That concept begins to come around following the Civil War. So Robbins has this ability to mass produce watches, but now he has to actually figure out how to sell that many watches. Because you remember, it's a brand new product. He can mass produce. Demand isn't quite caught up with his ability to produce. And so he has to figure out ways to improve the marketing, the sales techniques, the distribution. He basically has to invent distribution channels for such a wide array of watches to be able to be sold throughout the country, and then eventually, or within by the 1860s, throughout the world. And then the next big thing he does is he basically takes these machines or that his team is inventing and enables people to be kind of semi-skilled workers. You don't have to know a whole lot about watches. As long as you can be skilled and manipulate a machine, you can begin building watches. And so that's how he's able to kind of transform this watch industry so quickly with watches that become known as cheap and reliable.
Amazing stuff. So it was the right businessman at exactly the right moment in American history and in technological development. Kind of just seized the moment, is what it seems like to me. So,
Absolutely. Yep.
is it accurate then to say that Waltham was like the dominant company in the market in their heyday? Then was there anybody that could compete with them at that level at that time?
So until 1864-65, Waltham is basically the only competitor that is worth noting. By 1865, the Elgin National Watch Company comes into business, and they're in Elgin, Illinois. And they begin competing with Waltham. They hire away a lot of Waltham's employees, and Waltham has its match in Elgin. Now, Waltham is always able to outproduce Elgin, but Elgin is never far behind, and they become a source of competition, which is really what forces Waltham to make its first strategic choice of wanting to have the lowest cost structure while still making great products. So this is where we get into this concept of cheap and reliable, and we see that theme play out throughout the rest of Waltham's history going into 1900 is the strategic choice they made early, which was to outcompete Elgin on price and quality as opposed to focusing on different segments of the market.
Right. I seem to recall that they never really put out any kind of a luxury line, or just a very minuscule percentage was focused on the higher tier pricing. I think a lot of their watches were intended for the enlisted soldier of the Civil War. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Waltham has many watches they make. Like if you go to a collector show now, they're primarily focused on the nice Waltham watches that they made. But for example, by 1900, Waltham is making about 1 million watches a year. Only about 1% of those, or less than 1% of those, are actually what we would consider luxury watches, which is a highly adjusted watch that is what we'd consider now like an officially certified watch that is typically in a gold case or a high valued platinum case. And so that Waltham has a very minuscule amount of watches that are considered that highest grade. The vast majority of them are this cheap and reliable, which you're much more likely to find in your, grandparents' drawer or in a old family member's drawer. You will find those older pocket watches that have been passed down, but many of them are not what you'd consider the best of Waltham's watches.
Okay, I see. But these were intended as tools to be used. I take it, not something to be shown off or necessarily like an heirloom to be passed down or anything like that.
Yes and no. So I would say yes in the way you phrased it there, but keep in mind that a lot of people are able to they're stretching their budget to be able to afford a watch. So the big thing is Waltham's able to focus on this middle class customer for the first time and
Hmm.
be able to provide a watch. So for many of them, it would be up to 2 months' pay, for example, for a private in the Union Army to be able to afford Waltham's cheapest watch. But we find that many of them were willing to pay that just to own it, and many of them cared about them deeply. And there's even a example, another historian, Alexis McCrossan, cites where this soldier writes a letter giving his watch to his friend before an impending attack and says, "Hey, if something happens to me, make sure my parents get this because it means so much to me."
Okay. Okay. I see. Good. So, meanwhile, the Swiss, they don't have this technological revolution going on, but are they also trying to appeal to the middle class, or are they more of a luxury brand, or and is that their audience anyway?
So the Swiss industry prior to 1876 is very bimodal. So on one hand, you have the luxury producers such as Patek Philippe. They were in business back then. They were a Waltham competitor and were also at the Centennial Exhibition, as was Audemars Piguet. However, most of the Swiss watches that were being produced were these cheap watches, and they were actually viewed as kind of how we would view outsourced production now for emerging economies, or emerging economies serving as the outsourced production. That's really what the Swiss were at the time. And they were actually known for kind of, there's a quote where they say, we send the worst trash to America. They knew their watches were bad and they were embarrassed by the quality of them. And so that's one of the outcomes of the Centennials when they see America is able to make these highly reliable watches. The Swiss are embarrassed that they have been providing America with this quote, worst trash in watches. And so part of the problem that was a result of this was they're not using machine made parts, so they're non-precision. And anytime you have that complex of a mechanical movement, any non-precision that you introduce to it, it just makes it unreliable. And meanwhile, Waltham has this, they're using machine production and they also have these steam powered machines. So they're able to use higher quality metal. Waltham actually invests in metallurgy to make sure that it's using the best metals. So Waltham watches are both more exact, they're cheaper made, and they're higher quality metals, which all combines to make the Swiss watch a much more unreliable watch when compared to Waltham.
And that is so mind blowing to me. I swear, just how fortunes have been so reversed since that time period. But
yeah,
I learned something every time I read a book for this, and I was very glad to learn about that. So let's talk about this Centennial Exhibition then, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I understand that it was a real watershed event, not just in the context of this story, but for America and for the world as a whole. In fact, so can you talk about exactly what the Centennial Exhibition meant?
Yeah, so probably the two is one of the great World's Fairs of its time, and probably the two that most people are familiar with, at least in America, are the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in the 1850s. And then you have the 1893 Columbian exhibition in Chicago, which if you've ever read the book, The Devil in the White City, it's focused around that World's Fair. The 1876 Centennial is the first major World's Fair that takes place in America. And it's in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park, which you can still visit today. 10 million people would visit this. And this was at a time when there was only 40 million Americans. So think of,
My
per
gosh.
capita, 1 in 4 people visiting it. Debuting at the Centennial were Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, the typewriter, the gas combustion engine, and the sewing machine. So many of these things that we kind of view as, technological marvels still to this day, that when, how they change society, that's where people saw these for the very first time. And so this was really America's first introduction to the world, and also the first time the world really realizes that America, its industry is extremely powerful and inventive, and basically sends a message that America will be able to dominate global mass production within a few decades.
Yeah, the description of it in the book is incredible, and some of the photos that you have, like the gigantic steam engine in the center of the hall that was powering everything. I think it was
Yeah.
a coreless engine. I think it was like 45 feet tall.
Yep.
Just incredible stuff. And I would have loved to have seen that. I would love to go back in time and see that exhibition with eyes for the first time.
I've
But
actually put, if you check listeners, as you are listening along, if you check on my website on aaronstarkbooks.com, there is a historical photos section, and you'll actually see a picture from the Centennial Exhibition. And I show 2 before and after shots. One is the main building, which at the time it was the largest enclosed space in the world. And it reaches hundreds of feet high, or over 100 feet high. And it's just this massive building. And now there's an overgrown fountain where this stage used to be, and you can see, before and after. It will blow your mind.
hmm.
And then another one, and we actually show where Waltham's exhibit was in Machinery Hall, and there's basically a log in the middle of a drainage pond now, roughly exactly where Waltham's exhibit was. So
Oh wow.
you can go and see the before and after pictures. It'll blow your mind.
I'll have to do that. I've seen the before pictures, but not the after pictures. I'll have to check that out right after this. So the Waltham exhibition in particular, like what did they choose to show off with all of these visitors from all over the country and all over the world?
Yeah, so most exhibitors came and just saw it as an opportunity to show their machines and put them in like a display type manner. But Royal Robbins was the owner of Waltham, was truly a visionary, and he, in the letters that he writes to his board of directors and his shareholders, which are all maintained in Harvard's archives, he actually shows a very calculated strategy. So he begins talking about, by February of 1876, so 4 months before the centennial, he lays out a very well-planned exhibit. and he indicates that they've already started work on it. So presumably we can think they've been working on this for at least a couple of weeks, if not months. And as what it is he says, I want to show a mini assembly line. But he also shows an element of cautiousness by saying we're only going to limit it to a few machines. So he is aware that other people are curious in their ability to produce. But when he says we're going to limit it to a few machines, his purpose was he wanted to scare off competition. So the machines he chooses are the ones that he thinks are most likely to send a message to competitors that Waltham is dominating the market already, and there's nothing you're going to do that will overcome Waltham. So two notable machines that he sends there. The first is a pinion machine, which is generally unremarkable. But what I found most interesting is Waltham has a list of the people that they sent to the Centennial to work their machines. And I began doing research on these people, and most of them were women. They sent 18 workers, and 13 of them were women, which was not uncommon. 40% of Waltham's employees were women. And there's a lady named Eliza Putnam who works this pinion machine. And it's actually called the Webster Marsh automated pinion machine. And the fact that it's made by Webster will become interesting in a minute. But what's cool about Eliza Putnam is she is completely unremarkable, and you won't find her really anywhere in history. But recently I had the president of the Waltham Historical Society contacted me, and they actually found a picture of Eliza Putnam that is a verified picture where her name is listed on the back of the photo. And it was really neat because she's an ordinary worker who attended this exhibition. Jacques David would have seen her, and she's operating this machine made by Ambrose Webster. And here we get to bring her to life. So I've actually put that picture on the website. You can check it out. But that was a really neat discovery recently.
Absolutely. I love digging into the small details like that. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the second one is this thing called the automatic screw machine, which Theophilus Gribby, who we have not talked about yet, but he was actually Jacques David's partner. He was commissioned by the Swiss to go as a judge to the World's Fair to help with judging. And when he got there, he saw the automatic screw machine, and he actually writes back to Switzerland with alarm and says, we have been left behind. Like, we have to do something about this. And that is what causes the Swiss trade industry to send Jacques David to join Gribby. And that is how those two end up paired, is after seeing the automatic screw machine, which ultimately led to everything we see, forthcoming here in the book.
Yeah, some of the writings that you included in the book, they were using such a tone of alarm, which I did not expect at all. But I mean, they were talking in terms of catastrophe for their entire industry. I could tell just from seeing this exhibit, just from seeing Eliza Putnam and a few other workers at this, what I think of as a relatively small exhibit. They looked at that and they just saw disaster on the horizon for all of them, really, which was quite amazing. So did David come because he was sent to learn what Waltham was doing, or was he just there as an observer, generally speaking, of the American watch industry at the time?
Yeah, so David gets commissioned in August to come join Gribby, and the SIIJ, which is obviously an acronym, is basically the Society of Jura Industries. So the Jura is the Jura region of Switzerland where watches are made, and you can think of it like the Swiss Watch Trade Association of the time. And so this Swiss Watch Trade Association had been formed to look out for their collective interests, and they select David to join Gribby. And they actually have documented instructions to conduct a, quote, very detailed study of the American watch industry. And they tell him to look at everything from finance to operations to machines, basically anything you would need to run a business. And so David arrives into America around August 24th. We actually have his arrival into New York Harbor on a manifest. And then he quickly joins Gribby at the Centennial, and then quickly heads to Boston, where we know he was by the 20th of September.
Okay, I see. So, like we mentioned at the very beginning, he was just kind of exactly the right man in the right place to take full advantage of all the information that was available and also that which was not available. So, did he have any kind of I guess I wouldn't call it a background in intelligence, but was he a a diplomat, or did he just get to have good sales tactics, or what was it that made him so special?
Yeah, so Jacques David worked for what was the very early version of the Longines watch company, which that brand is still around today. But they were a very early adopter of mechanized watch production. And David was an engineer. He was a watchmaker, but he was primarily an engineer. And they had worked to design watchmaking equipment. They would have called it automated watch production, but once they saw Waltham's exhibits, they actually say, what we call automated machines is nothing compared to what Waltham has. But David had the eye, he understood, and he had the vision for what it could be. And so that's mostly what made him an ideal choice. Although what is most amazing is, I have zero background in industrial espionage or understanding espionage as a, in modern days and what defines that. But if you were to take David and the things he's able to do, it matches extremely well with what are kind of considered expert, historical methods of espionage. David manages to fit those to a T. And in fact, there's a very good book from the 1980s on industrial espionage, or it's really on countering industrial espionage when that was a big problem in Western economies. And many of the things they describe, you could basically superimpose on David's report. And it's amazing considering he has no background in this, yet he is able to do it artfully and skillfully.
Hmm. Yeah, he was a very, very impressive character all around. So, how did he begin to perform, or what did he begin to perform to find out everything that he could about this industry? Because he basically went by the exhibition. He was obviously extremely impressed, or maybe extremely concerned about what he saw. But where does he go from there, as an obvious representative of the Swiss watch industry, a foreigner who's only in the United States for a fairly limited amount of time? Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP, or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. That's slnt.com.
Yeah, so one thing he goes to the Centennial Exhibition and he links up with Gribby. There's a 1947 Swiss history that talks about David's visit to America. And is what's most interesting is they will talk about him coming to America, and they say that, he visits the Centennial and he sees entire watches being made, and he begins to capture all the information about how this takes place. And then this history continues and says, but there's a lot of obstacles for him to do this, because when he arrives, everybody knows who he is, and everybody is excited. They say there's great cries from everyone. And he was right about all the obstacles. And as what's interesting about that is this history indicates that they knew that there was a reason that they should be almost embarrassed for how they get this information. So they're trying to put a backstory for how they came into holding it. But as what we know is Waltham didn't display, they only displayed a few machines to manufacture a few pieces and parts, certainly not whole watches. And then the second part is David's name doesn't appear in any records. He's not mentioned in any newspaper. The only place he is mentioned in any American records is the arriving ship's manifest. In contrast, Theo Gribby is mentioned a lot of places, and he actually later in life comes to America and becomes a well-regarded watchmaker in America. So his name is everywhere in American records. Jacques David is absent from all American records. So we know there's more to the story than meets the eye. But again, I mentioned this letter he writes. And in there, this is a direct quote from his letter, obviously translated. But it says, I sped through quickly and incognito and saw the poor arrangements I already knew about. I did not really have time to have a good look around nor to ask questions, but we have inside sources and we shall soon have the information we want. So we know for a fact he goes into the factory, he goes in disguise. I posit that, probably as a common worker, that's like considered the most common form of infiltration prior to the digital era. So you posit that could have been how he entered, but we don't really know. We do know that he recruits employees. In fact, in his report, he tells us he recruits employees, but he always talks about these sources who have provided information. And so he mentions them. And then we do know actually one employee by name that we can talk about in a minute, who turns out to be a key person for his investigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what he wrote in that letter, I mean, there's no way that guy is not a natural spy. You know what I mean? I mean, he obviously knew exactly what needed to be done, and it seemed like he just reflexively knew what needed to be done. So
and if I can add one thing on that too. So in his letter, he tells us he had to speed through quickly and incognito. But what's so keen about him is he's so observant. In his letter, he goes, Waltham greatly exceeds everything we've been told and everything we believed. The neatness, the cleanliness, the machines, the organization of every detail are as perfect as you can imagine. And then he documents many details in his report that only a keen observer would see. He notes family pictures on the walls. He notes the quality of the furniture. He notes drinking fountains. All these things are something that somebody with a detailed eye would have to observe.
Yeah, this guy would find a place in any intelligence organization that I can think of, honestly, with the skill set that he brought. But so tell me about the factory a little bit, because I've seen the exterior. It's a very, very large building even now. So I'm just kind of picturing, did he just join a line of hundreds of workers streaming in for the morning shift or something like that? Is that kind of what you speculate?
Yeah, so a common Gilded Age method for controlling manufacturing and time costing and efficiency was workers were only allowed to show up when the factory opened, around 7 a.m. They could go at lunch and then at the end of the day. So that would be, if you snuck in as a common worker, that would have been how you would have to join. Other potentials exist. Maybe he went as a disguised VIP of some kind, although I suspect that Jacques David would have had likely an accent, although that was very common in industrial New England. So that wouldn't have necessarily set him apart, but it would have at least called some attention to him in industrial New England. But as far as the factory that he describes, it really runs contrary to our view of the industrial era. And in fact, when I was writing the book and I had it reviewed, the reviewer came back and said, I doubt your sources. This describes a factory that is basically pristine, that took care of its workers, that cared for its employees and provided pristine working conditions. That is not what happened in the Gilded Age.
Yeah.
And so that actually caused me to go look for more sources. And sure enough, Jacques David is I would view as a relatively independent source, but he's only one data point. There's another guy who visits the factory in 1887, who's the former editor of the New York Times. And he runs a newspaper now that is designed to attack the capitalists that he views are mistreating workers. And he is known, he's famous. You can find research papers written about how he looked out for the common worker. Well, he visits Waltham and he writes a 8-page report talking about how excellent Waltham is and how its owner, Royal Robbins, believes that, taking care of workers is the key to profitability. And as you read it, I've had many people say, this sounds like the innovative tech company of the modern era, transplanted 150 years ago. And it's very true. Waltham was one of the first companies who had like on-site medical care. They had on-site daycares for working women. So many of these things that we think, no way, that couldn't have happened. It did happen at Waltham. And so I thought that was very exciting.
Amazing. Yeah, I recall also there was a little anecdote in the book that they employed a pretty shocking number of like amputee war veterans as well. Even guys that couldn't really work anymore, they couldn't perform as they could have, prior to the war, of course, and they still kept those guys on and paid them a very good salary and that sort of thing, which was, I mean, that's incredibly forward thinking for, what I think of as a Gilded Age industrialist, just like you said.
Absolutely.
Wow. So he made it through the factory, I guess presumably in a morning or something like that. We don't really know. And then he leaves and he writes this report, right? Which I know kind of is pretty amazing in itself. Can you talk about that report that he wrote a little bit?
Yeah, so the report ends up being about 130 pages, and it's a combination of pictures, drawings, financial statements. The financial statements are extremely detailed. One of the things that I did as a person interested in finance when I was in graduate school is I actually pulled Waltham's financial statements that they would report annually, and then actually all their ledgers are also maintained in Harvard's archives. So I was able to reconstruct their financial statements for the accounts that David notes. And David's only off by anywhere from about 1% to 5% in his financial statement estimates for Waltham. And he says that these aren't exact, but they're close enough to be usable. And it's kind of funny because now, if you were to ask most people at their companies, like, could you quote to me your financial statements? They wouldn't be as close as David is with Waltham. And another thing he notes in there is he talks about the pay of workers. And in his report, he actually says, people are very secretive about their wages, and they tend to maintain that discretion. And then he proceeds to lay out Waltham's entire pay structure. So you see, well, wait a minute, I thought you said people don't talk about it, but he got it from somewhere, which
Man.
leads us to, where did he get all of the information for his report? And this, I think, was maybe the biggest breakthrough, if you will, or most exciting thing for me with this research on Waltham, because there's this very storied employee named Ambrose Webster, who I mentioned was the father of Waltham's automated production. And if you talk to pocket watch enthusiasts, Ambrose Webster is considered one of the godfathers of Waltham. And in David's letter that he sends in September of 1876, he said, "We tried to work out the financials and we tried to work out their outgoings without reaching a precise result. Mr. W., the former director on the mechanical side, who is helping us in this respect, has made us think seriously about this question. The impression we gained through these visits is that we really need to follow in their footsteps if we're not to be chased out of the market by them." And then he continues and basically talks about how Webster is going to help them discern all this information. And it makes 100% sense when we see that Webster was basically, by the time he leaves Waltham in the summer of 1876, he is the assistant superintendent. So he's the third highest officer in Waltham and would have had access and would have had intimate knowledge of all of these details.
Oh,
Webster, when he leaves Waltham, he quickly goes into business on his own. And in David's report, he recommends Webster as the person that all the Swiss watchmakers should go buy machines from. Simultaneously, as David is writing this report in November, Webster announces that he is going to grow his company from 6 employees to 80 employees and start a new factory. That might seem circumstantial, except when you think the world is in the middle of the Panic of 1873. All peer companies, including Waltham, have actually idled their companies because there's no business. Yet Webster sees this forthcoming windfall and begins ramping up his employees and ramping up his factory to meet the demands.
Mm-hmm.
And we know by 1892, there's a newspaper article that says Webster's actually visited every factory in Switzerland and is very well acquainted with the Swiss. And so basically we have David saying Webster's going to help us. And then we see Webster investing heavily in his own opportunities and David recommending Webster. And as what was most fun about this is I actually had a lifelong Waltham historian write me and said, "This has been sitting in plain sight. I can't believe I never put 2 and 2 together, but it never occurred to me these two could be related." And
Amazing.
Sure enough, it's Jacques David's letter that connects it all.
Amazing stuff. Well, so Webster clearly has a financial motive for helping because he's left the company. But do you happen to have any insight, or can you speculate? Did he leave the company under a cloud? Did he want to see Royal Robbins and Waltham go under for any reason, or did he just want to, expand his own company just as Waltham had expanded while he was there?
Yeah, so Webster formally, we have in the newspaper of Waltham's newspaper, they talk about Webster retiring in June of 1876. Obviously, that's before David arrives. So, the more innocent explanation would be Webster retires, goes to the Centennial. He happens to meet David and Gribby, in August. And we know Webster went to the Centennial, so it's very plausible that they met there. And it may have been Webster that approached them. We just don't know.
Hmm.
The other plausible explanation is that Webster actually met Gribby. Gribby was in the US starting in April. So we know that David is already referring to him as Mr. W in his correspondence back to Switzerland. So it's very plausible that, they're already referring to him as Mr. W before David even arrives. So we don't really know when they meet. We just know that they eventually connect and he ultimately provides them with information.
Wow. Yeah, still some unanswered questions there, unfortunately. But yeah, no question in my mind that Webster was kind of like the insider to end all insiders, since he was there from the beginning and built the company up with his own bare hands in a very literal sense like that. And then for him to make himself available to the Swiss watch industry through David and Gribby is just an incredible turn of events for the American watch industry as a whole and Waltham specifically as well. It's really dramatic stuff.
Absolutely.
So, what was the result of this 130-page report that was written? Which, by the way, sounds like one of the best intelligence products I've ever heard of in my life. Written
Yeah.
by a complete novice in that field, anyway. But anyway, how was that report received once it was actually presented?
Yeah. So David writes this report when he gets back, and everybody mostly ignores him. Most of the most prominent voices in the Swiss watch industry were the famous makers, Patek Philippe and these other prominent luxury brands, but they're actually a very small minority. And it's not that different from now, it'd say like, if you go on Twitter, people on Twitter represent our opinion. Not really, it's a very small portion of people. It's a slice, but it's the loudest slice.
Oh, okay,
And
sure.
so yeah, and so they're the ones pushing back against this report because they don't have any need to follow it. They're still getting orders. They're still known as, luxury makers. They can only produce a few watches per year and they have no problem selling them. So to them, this is a completely pointless exercise. But David, one of the things that kind of sets him apart is he tells everybody, no, 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 this is really, really bad. I'm warning you that we're going to fail if we don't do something. But then he actually proposes a whole new system. And so David has a couple things that he introduces. The first is a factory system. And he tells them, he said, look, you don't have to go do what the Americans do. I'm not asking you to imitate American factories. I'm asking you to emulate the outcome. So he says, let's take the best of what the Americans do and let's map it onto our society. So he convinces a few factories to form. And when I say factories, we're talking, small house size factories where no longer are people making watches in their home or parts of a watch in their home. We're asking you to all meet at this, small house powered by a hydraulic water wheel. And we're going to make some factory made parts that we can then match together and, ensure that the watch works. And so this was kind of a novel concept, but it fit with the societal constraints that David knew he was going to face. The second thing is he encourages enforcing standards on the quality of the watch as well as gold and silver. There was rampant counterfeiting at this time. And he said, look, we need to stop being responsible for Swiss watchmakers who are embarrassing us. And so he says, I encourage, all of us to get together. There will be standards of quality. Your watches are expected to meet the standard of quality. If they are, we will give it a certificate where it'll be officially certified. And that's really the beginning of what we know as like official certification now. So if any of you happen to be wearing a Rolex watch, if you look down, you'll see it says officially certified. That was the basis for it, was Jacques David recommending that standards for quality, that it had to meet certain requirements. The next thing David does is he says, there's no way we're going to get the whole society on board unless we start introducing it into our schools, in our education system. So they already had some watchmaking schools, similar to now we would have trade schools. They had trade schools for watchmakers. And he said, we have to get the factory system in there. All of the 7 schools said no, but David happened to be on the board for one of those schools and convinced them to try it. And so in 1877, we see the education system beginning to adopt it. By 1893, we have the 1893 World's Fair, and in there, the judges actually note that the entire Swiss education system now educates their students on the factory system. So we know that David's idea caught on and began to infiltrate the entire generation of Swiss watchmakers.
Hmm.
But the biggest thing that Jacques David does is not a functional thing. He rather encourages the Swiss where to compete. So he has kind of a encourager by this guy who was also a judge at the Centennial named Edouard Favre-Perret. And Favre-Perret, along with David, identify that the Swiss while they make a lot of watches that are not high quality, they have a few, like the Patek Philippe, that are the highest quality. And they say, we should really focus on luxury watches. Let's focus our efforts there. We have this army of horologists. Let's make luxury watches. And then also, let's not try and compete in America, because if we do, we are going to lose. So they continue to sell luxury watches in America because there's really Waltham has chosen not to compete in the luxury market. But then everywhere else in the world, they basically flood the rest of the world with reliable, cheap watches. Meanwhile, Waltham is trying to do the same thing, but now the Swiss are able to do it much more cheaply because they don't have to compete with American tariffs selling watches in America. So they make this strategic choice to mostly abandon the American market, but only sell luxury watches. And then David's influence is, it's slow, but it's this adoption that begins happening. It's the flywheel. And we begin seeing in 1880s, there's articles about about Swiss watches becoming higher quality and more people wanting them. And then by 1890, we really begin seeing the shift back towards Swiss watches. And so when you think about the context of the 1890s, it's the rise of the Gilded Age, the rise of the robber barons, and people now want what nobody else can afford. And the Swiss watch becomes the embodiment of that, because Waltham, their whole model is cheap and reliable and mass produced. Meanwhile, the Swiss have said, no, we're going to focus on luxury watches. So 40% of Swiss production by the 1890s is in luxury watches. And in fact, in America, we find that most of the watches they send America are luxury watches. And I came across this really neat 1892 article from the Brooklyn Eagle. So think of it as the prominent newspaper for Brooklyn, New York. And in there on page 2, taking up almost the entire page, it lists all of these prominent people in Brooklyn and the watches they wear, how much they cost, and what the brand is. By this point, 40% of them are Swiss watches. Meanwhile, only 20% of them are American watches. So we can see now that it has now become cool to own a Swiss watch. Meanwhile, if you rewind 20 years prior, the premise of that would be unthinkable.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. So David eventually disrupted the entire Swiss industry over a very long period of time, but all for the better. I mean, everything he brought back was very slowly adopted with a lot of resistance along the way, but I guess we see the end result now. So with that said, what happened to Waltham? Like, what was the actual impact on Waltham of David's report and presumably of Webster giving away so much of what he had seen and done and learned at Waltham over the years?
Yeah, so I think the first question a lot of people ask is, did Waltham ever figure it out? We don't know if Waltham figured it out. They never wrote down that they figured it out, but that's not necessarily that uncommon. There was an academic study that found even in the modern day, many companies don't like to admit that they were victims, as it's an embarrassing reality. But while we do see that Royal Robinson, his reports to shareholders, does begin talking about the need for trade secrecy and not sharing information. In fact, in I think it's 1878, he says, I would share more plans, but I'm sure you don't want me to because for some reason people keep finding them out before they should. So he knows information's getting out, but he doesn't, indicate where or how. We do know that David, even as late as mid 1877, he's still getting information in Switzerland. So somebody's sending it to him. So
Hmm.
Robbins knows his information's getting out, and clearly we know David was still receiving it. But Waltham is a strategy. They continue to focus on this time-tested strategy of cheap and reliable. They view it as, they own that market and nobody's going to compete with them there. The problem they begin to encounter is, they have domestic competition from Elgin, and then there's a bunch of other American watch companies that continue to enter the market following basic economic principles. And they continue to try and make cheaper and cheaper. The problem is there's an end to where you can find cheaper. And so they continue to invest in heavier assets, more assets, to the point where their return on assets continues to diminish to where they're almost producing no profits, despite the fact that their sales continue to double every couple of years. And so
Hmm.
this time-tested strategy of cheap and reliable becomes a loser for them. And then there's a point where Robin says, I'd love to move into this luxury market, but nobody wants to buy our luxury watches, so we're not going to make them. And the reason nobody wants to buy them is because they now all want to buy Swiss watches.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we see that he wants to expand internationally, but he can't because the Swiss have cut him off in the international markets. So now Waltham has nowhere to go. So then they are like, well, I guess we're going to have to focus on domestic markets. And they continue to invest, and they just can't get out of the cycle of investment and profitability spiral where they can't make more money. And then is what really becomes kind of its iconic folly is to save money, they start cutting innovation. So they basically direct their watchmakers to stop trying to make cool new things. They used to do what people would refer to as Google had 20% time, or this idea of you could pursue new innovations and try things out. They basically tell their staff to stop doing that. And
Hmm.
so they begin to attrit this innovation culture. And then when the wristwatch comes around, they totally pass over it and choose not to get into it. Meanwhile, the Swiss embrace the wristwatch. In fact, Rolex is founded in this period, and they commit wholly to the wristwatch. And Waltham chooses to not do the wristwatch. And in one of their histories, it says, it was even questioned whether Waltham could even make a wristwatch because it requires such small parts that have to withstand hand movements, and Waltham doesn't have anybody who can do it.
Oh,
And
wow.
so Waltham doesn't get into wristwatches until the 1920s, but by this point, the Swiss are known throughout the world for making wristwatches, and they're considered a luxury product. So they are able to take the world's profits for luxury watches as a result. And so the Swiss really show us this idea that, it's not about who can make it cheaper. It's really about who has the better strategy. And so the Swiss are able to take all this information that David acquired, transform their industry, and then make strategic choices on moving into growing markets and out of declining markets more quickly. And that was much, much superior to Waltham's strategy of mass economies of scale.
My gosh. What a story. What a tragedy for that company in the end. And they were in some ways undone and potentially never even knew how or why, I guess you could say. I know it's not so clear cut as, Ambrose Webster talking, and that was spelled the end of the company, of course, but it really is sad to see their decline, their slow decline over years as the Swiss rose to prominence, based on things that they had taken from Waltham's early years of innovation. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have so much grudging respect for David because if there's one thing I can't stand, it's the idea of, foreign interlopers coming to America and stealing our very best ideas, especially from a company that takes such good care of its people and produces such a wonderful product. But, it's hard not to be incredibly impressed with that guy. He certainly was one in a million.
Yeah, there's actually a review somebody wrote, I believe it's on Audible, that basically says the book is misplaced admiration for David because he's able to do all this. And it's not that it's, positive or negative. It's just the fact he did it, and you can't not be impressed by the fact he was able to do this while being a complete amateur.
Absolutely, absolutely. And unlike a lot of the stories that we have covered on this podcast, like no lives were lost based on this loss of secret information or anything like that. So it is business, and business is
Absolutely.
cutthroat even under the best of circumstances. So for that reason, I'm able to kind of emotionally detach a little bit from what happened, and just be incredibly impressed with what he was able to pull off so quickly and seemingly so effortlessly. Wow, that's fantastic stuff. Well, Aaron, thank you so much. This has been really illuminating. And I do have one last question for you, though. Since we've been talking about watches this whole time, what is your own personal go-to watch?
I actually ended up probably my favorite personal watch is I actually took the pocket watch that my grandfather that I inherited and got it converted to a wristwatch.
Oh,
There's
wow.
a company named Vortic Watches out of Colorado where you can do that. And they'll make a case for it. And so I actually like to wear that as much as I can. It's a cool reminder.
Very cool. Yeah, send me a picture of it after this if you don't mind. I'd love to see that.
Absolutely, will do.
Fantastic. So, are you working on any other books right now? Do you have any other plans in this genre? I mean, this was a really, really big opener for you, in my opinion. I was riveted all the way through, honestly.
Yeah, so not yet. I worked on this first one. It was, more of a hobby or a passion project coming out of, grad school and just, being really interested in the subject. And honestly, I didn't expect it would become as popular as it has. This has been somewhat of a pleasant surprise. And I actually had a friend who was speaking at a Financial Times symposium this last week, and she told me that they actually, or she talked about the book, or they talked about the book briefly there. So I was, amazed to hear that. So that was pretty neat. But I would like to write another one, as I really enjoyed the process, and I really enjoyed kind of the idea of uncovering something that's been hidden in history. So I don't know if I wrote another one, if it would be in this exact genre of watches. It's a pretty niche topic, but definitely something along the lines of uncovering something in history that has been hiding there. I'd love to do that, but now just need to find the time.
I certainly know the feeling there, and I definitely share your interest in those kind of obscure topics, bring them up to light, regardless of the genre. So great work on this one. Once again, for everybody listening, the book is called Disrupting Time by Aaron Stark, and it's available now. I just read it earlier this week. It's a fast read. It's very easy to follow and very, very fascinating. It is a little bit of a departure from a lot of what I've read because it's not national level agencies or anything like that, but it was a refreshing read. It was really fun, and I learned quite a bit. So if you are interested in watches, if you're interested in 19th century, if you're interested in Industrial Revolution, anything like that, then this is the book for you, certainly. So, Aaron, thanks so much for your time. You mentioned your website. Do you also have like a social media presence that people can follow you on, anything like that?
So mostly I do LinkedIn and the website. I recently got Twitter, although I am a novice. I would also recommend as a one thing, and you can find more information on the website if you're more of a audiobook listener. The audiobook version is phenomenal. It is read by a multiple award-winning Will Dameron and does a phenomenal job. So please check that out if you are into audiobooks as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.